I had met an English pastor at a retreat in California, and he invited me to stay with him in London, never thinking that I would show up. I knocked on his door, and he nearly fainted, and he didn't have any place for me in his home, but he got me a tiny apartment down the street that only cost a little bit to stay in, but I was not, but I hadn't planned to pay for a room in an apartment, so it was very difficult. And anyway, eventually I got to stay with Charlie Riggs, and he set up where movie theaters would have Billy Graham on their screen, and people would come and fill those theaters up uh, and come and sit free in the theater for the Billy Graham Crusades. And then they had trained counselors to work in each of those theaters. And Charlie Riggs was in charge of that kind of an advanced thing to get more people who couldn't come to the big stadium to actually hear Billy Graham and make decisions. So hundreds of decisions came as a result of this landline they talked about that Charlie was in charge of. Then then Graham went on across the channel to Paris and Amsterdam, and had his crusade of 1 or 2 or 3 days there. And one of the difficulties was in Amsterdam, because they use a soccer stadium. They had a mesh wire up because the soccer stadium people got so violent in the matches, they would run out on the field. So they had them where they couldn't do that. But so how is Billy Graham going to get someone on the field where he's inviting people to come forward? Well, the only thing we could do was take them out of the stadium, and there were 4 main entrances. And so I and others were pointing people to come out of the stadium and to one of the doors. So they came out of the stadium into one of the doors, but a number of the people did not go back in. And so we lost some of the people that we could have gotten. But the Graham team was very happy and satisfied that they were able to use a stadium where they could not come forward but had to go backward to go through a main gate to get to where Dr. Graham was inviting people to come forward. And that went on for a number of days in Amsterdam. And then we flew into Berlin, and there was a brief crusade in Berlin, but the communists controlled half of Berlin, so it was very difficult to get Billy Graham. He was unable to get into the communist part of Berlin, so he was in the other part, but people came across from communist China, communist Russia, that was controlled by, the Russians were controlling East Berlin, and they came across and snuck in where they could hear Billy Graham, and many made decisions for Christ that were in East Germany. And then they went back there to evangelize. It was a wonderful experience, and many people told their testimony later on when the wall was down and people could go back and forth about how they had been saved, crawling under a wall or at night when there were no searchlights. They went to where Graham was having his crusade on the western side of the wall. So many victories there. So I enjoyed so much that experience, and I went on down through Europe, where Graham would have 1-day crusades or would meet with people to set up crusades for the future. And this went on all the way down into Italy. I remember meeting a former Catholic priest who had been converted, and I had a marvelous time. He had a car, and he picked me up along the road and actually witnessed to me, and I found out he was a converted Catholic priest. So we had a ball traveling there, and I went down into Italy there with him and spent a week or two in Italy staying in various homes and talking to missionaries and others there in Italy. Graham, as I recall, was able to maybe have one crusade in Italy, but it was difficult because of the Roman Catholic Church and their headquarters there. I was so blessed with this opportunity, and I saw how they had various trouble, and the Graham team were denied this or that. And one thing, they would interview Billy Graham, and then they would put the opposite of what he said in the newspaper. The newspaper reporters would lie about what Billy Graham had said. And so there was a meeting, a prayer meeting for over an hour. What shall we do? And the Graham team talked, and I was sitting in the room away from that, but heard the conversation. And what they decided was Billy Graham was asked the same questions by reporters in every city, basically the same 8 or 10 questions. How did you start in this? How much money do you make? This thing and that. And so what they said, let's take the 10 questions that all the reporters ask, and we print up Billy's answer, and we hand these out and said, these are the questions that you ask, and here are the answers. And that way they stopped people lying about what Graham had said. And it was a fabulous thing to print up the answers of the questions that everyone asked, with answers that were biblical, with scripture that went with the answers. And God really led on that. It was really a miracle, a decision that the team made, that he did not give any more interviews. He handed out his interviews with the questions and answers. Now he would get with certain leaders in the country. He met with the president of Germany. He met with a number of the Catholic leaders in Spain and in Mexico and in Italy. And God seemed to open doors. He simply was an anointed man, and God opened the doors. And wherever he went, everyone wanted to hear this blonde, good-looking guy from America that was really anointed by the Holy Spirit. And so thousands of people heard the gospel and were converted. And that was an experience I'll never forget.
What did you learn about trusting God in Europe?
I had almost no money. Just a few euro, a few American dollars is all I had. And so I said, Lord, I'm believing you. I remember I was going from one town in France to another, and the battle had been so strong in France, there were ruins all over the place where the Germans and the French had fought each other, and homes were blown up and streets here and there. And I saw people on bicycle, and I wondered, what's this guy have on his hand? And he had a loaf of bread, a long loaf of bread, maybe 2 feet long, on his head, strapped with a rubber band around, and he was riding his bicycle along the road. He had gone to the baker's, got the bread, was taking it home. And so I said, where'd you get the bread? And he said, down so-and-so. And so I asked, I went back there and I said, could I get some bread? Oh, no, I can't pay for a long loaf. What would it cost me to get 6 inches? And he said, where are you from? I said, I'm from the United States, and I've been following Mr. Billy Graham, the American evangelist. They said, well, we've got some bread here that's broken off, and give me 1 coin and I'll give you some bread. And so for breakfast for a couple of days, And one day, that's all I had was some bread that I had gotten from that bread man. And I was so thankful because Jesus is the bread of life.
So another trip you went, or this trip, another trip you went, you were asked by Bill Bright to scout out new work in Europe. So talk about Campus Crusade for Christ and scouting out new work in Europe. Tell about that trip.
I attended a conference. I'd worked for Bill Bright, loaned to him from Dawson Trotman. Dawson Trotman had Leroy Imes and I and one other guy that he loaned. Bright said, give me your top soul winners. So Dawson said, would you be willing to work a year with Bill Bright? And we said, yes, we would. So we left the Navigators and went to a conference in California where Bill Bright taught you. Bill had a gospel presentation. It was called a clincher. And you have memorized a 1-minute gospel introduction. You memorized a 3-minute introduction. And then you memorized a 20-minute gospel presentation. Like you're waiting for an elevator, you got 1 minute, you can talk about Jesus. And you're going up an escalator, you can talk about Jesus for 1 minute. And we memorized ways of sharing Jesus Christ that Bill Bright had written out for us, and we memorized those. And then we practiced them. One thing about Bill Bright that it's good to remember, we stayed in various homes around friends of Bill Bright, and Bill Bright had the girls stay in his home where he was, and then we boys would come from people that loved Campus Crusade or something like that, and where they'd given us a place to spend the night. I stayed on a pallet on the floor a number of nights, and we would meet, and we would have coffee and something very light for breakfast, and then Bill Bright would say, now let's go pray. So we would all get on our knees for 30 minutes to 45 minutes, and I want you to know my knees were killing me. And sometimes I would turn sideways because my knees were hurting so bad in a kneeling position around with chairs, and we were praying 45 minutes to an hour there. And Bill would go out and take a taxi to go this or that, and he would come back and tell how he had led the taxi guy to Christ. It was hard for me to believe, but I know he wasn't lying. But Bill could go anywhere, introduce someone to Christ, and win them to Christ before he got out of the cab. This happened again and again and again. I was with one of the great soul winners in all the world was Bill and Vanette Bright. They had no children then, and so they were very flexible and so forth. And Henrietta Mears, who was the educational director at Hollywood Presbyterian Church, was a close personal friend of theirs, and she was a multimillionaire. And so she helped support Campus Crusade and had Bill and Vanette even stay in her home, which was a maybe a 10 or 15 bedroom house. And she was educational director at the largest Presbyterian church on the West Coast. And so she said, would you guys like to meet with me and learn how I help people to know Christ? And we said yes. So she said, okay, then be at the door at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. If you're here at 6:05, you can't get in. So we were there about 5:50, and it was cold as it could be. Another time it was raining, and we huddled by the door to try to keep from getting soaked. At the exact time she opened the door, took only the people that were there and locked the door. So if you weren't there when she said, if you weren't hungry, you didn't get it. And so then we would ask about her testimony, and she would tell how her father was a banker and she had inherited from her father, and she felt she had to find some way to make the money pay off. and she said the one person I know that is producing more than anyone else outside some major local church, like they had Hollywood Presbyterian Church. There were a number of movie stars that were in that church, and Bill Bright was a member of that church, and Henrietta Mears was educational director of that church. So anyway, she began then to support Bill and Lynette Bright, and wherever they needed to go, she raised the money or had the money